torture, repression, fake fabricated elections, and so on. All fine, as long as the people are quiet. Actually, that perhaps one of the most dramatic revelations from WikiLeaks was something that didn't happen. The headlines from the WikiLeaks revelations were mostly about really a significant event. The headlines read that the Arab world supports the United States on Iran. If you look at the cables, what they say is that the Arab dictators support, allegedly, who knows what they actually said, but they allegedly support a U.S. antagonism towards Iran. So everything's fine. There's something that wasn't said, namely, what does the Arab world think about this? That's known. There are recent polls taken by very respected, prestigious Western polling agencies, which have been taking polls in the Arab world for years. The most important one was released just last August by the Brookings Institution in Washington. There hasn't been a word reporting it, because who cares? Just the Arab world, the Arab population. And it turns out that in the Arab population there's a segment of opinion that does agree with the United States. 10% regard Iran as a threat. 88% regard Israel as the main threat. 77% regard the United States as the main threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy towards Iran is so overwhelming that a majority, 57%, think the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons as a deterrent to the real enemy, the United States and Israel. Well, Muashar principle comes in again. As long as they're quiet, we can disregard what they think. We can disregard the campaign of hatred in Pakistan. We can disregard antagonism in the Arab world until they break their chains. Then we've got to do something. And what we do is turn to a very familiar game plan over and over again. This is what's happening there is not just the Arab world. In fact, it's around the world. In fact, it even applies domestically. There are plenty of suffering in the United States, not on third world levels, but severe. But as long as people are quiet, we can continue, with huge bonuses to the CEO of Goldman Sachs, stagnation for most of the population. Everything's fine as long as people are passive and quiet, and we can direct their anger somewhere else. The game plan in Egypt is the usual one. Try to preserve the dictator as long as possible. If you can't preserve him anymore, shut him aside. Try to sustain the existing system as much as possible, maybe with some new names. And that's exactly what's playing out in Egypt. How it will turn out, we'll see. But we can't honestly ignore the fact that we're playing a big role there and have for a long time, the British as well, before us. Well, we should, I think that what all of this should lead us to recognize is that we should be attuned to our own role in these crises around the world, sometimes massive, sometimes marginal, but almost always there, because the U.S. is so powerful. One reason is just honesty. We ought to be honest enough to understand who we are. But another is just an elementary moral reason. We can do something about a humanitarian crisis to the extent that we're involved. If we have nothing to do with it and can't do anything about it, well, we can bemoan it, but we have no responsibility to do anything because we can't. On the other hand, if we're extensively involved, as is usually the case, then we can do quite a lot if we choose. And that's a good lesson to carry over to the topic of this evening, the Israel-Palestine confrontation. There are a lot of problems all over the world. It's easy to list them. For many of them, it's extremely hard to think up a solution that would make sense and that could work. This is one of those rare cases where there's a very easy solution. Furthermore, a solution that is accepted by virtually the entire world and has been for 35 years. The solution is there is an international border which is internationally recognized. And the solution is to have a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe some minor and mutual modifications that was official U.S. policy when it was part of the world 45 years ago. So you'd have Israel as it is within its borders, a Palestinian state within the territories that were occupied in 1967. Well, there's almost the entire world supports that. The Europe, the non-aligned countries, the Arab League, all the Arab states, the Organization of Islamic States, which happens to include Iran. There's almost no opposition to it except the United States and Israel. The United States and Israel have blocked it for 35 years and still do. That's the barrier to a solution. There's no part of the world where our influence and participation is so extreme. In fact, when I talk about Israel from now on, what you should actually hear is U.S.-Israel, because we're working in tandem right through this period. And it continues. President Obama came into office in January 2009. Right up until that time, Israel, meaning Israel and the United States, were carrying out a devastating attack against Gaza. Gaza is a defenseless prison. It was being mercilessly attacked by the U.S. and Israel. Obama was asked about it. He said he couldn't say anything because we only have one president. He was able to say that he deeply sympathizes with Israeli children who are being threatened by Hamas rockets, which he knew perfectly well could be stopped peacefully. I'll come back to that. He could say that, but nothing about children in Gaza who are being torn to shreds with U.S. weapons provided to in the hands of the Israeli army. But he did. The attack was very precisely planned. It ended minutes before Obama came into office. So then that saved him from the necessity to say something about the attack. What he could say and what he did is, well, let's not look to the past. Let's look to the present. Let's look to the future. So you didn't have to say anything about it. A couple of days later, he gave his first and, to this day, major speech about the Israel-Palestine conflict, which put to rest any possible thought that there might be some change in the extreme U.S. policy of rejectionism, which had prevented a political settlement. In the speech, he introduced his negotiator for the Middle East conflict, George Mitchell, which is a good choice if he has any if he would have had any leeway, but he didn't. He's now been pretty much replaced by Dennis Ross, who comes practically out of the Israeli lobby. He introduced Mitchell, and then he said that Obama, he said, well, there are, for the first time, he said, there are real prospects for peace. And he referred to the Arab League proposal, which called for a full peace agreement, full peace treaty with Israel, which he was reiterating much earlier ones, and went on to add that after the full peace treaty, the Arab states should move to full normalization of relations with Israel, new point. And Obama cited that. He said that's a big step forward. And he urged the Arab states to live up to their proposal and to normalize relations with Israel. Obama's person, he knows that that was not the Arab proposal, the Arab League proposal. The Arab League proposal was to have a a negotiated two-state settlement, and in that context to move on to normalization. By omitting the core of the proposal and saying, move on to normalization, Obama was telling us and the rest of the world that the United States is going to continue to block the political settlement, and that's exactly what has been happening since. No change from before. I'll come back to some of the details. Well, the conflict itself goes back a long time, well over a century, but a new phase, and the phase that's relevant for the immediate future, a new phase opened in 1967. Now, in 1960, that's when the Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan war took place and the occupied territories were conquered. Actually, at that time in 1967, there was a major conflict going on in the region. It was between Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Saudi Arabia is the center of radical Islamic fundamentalism and also the center of Islamic terror, along with Pakistan, two centers. That's one side, Saudi Arabia. The other side was Egypt, which was the center of secular nationalism. The United States supported radical Islamic fundamentalism, as it's been doing consistently. Britain even more so, and even much longer. There's a reason for that. In fact, Nasser, the president of Egypt, was compared with Hitler by the State Department and others. The reason was that it had nothing to do with human rights or anything like that. Saudi Arabia is one of the worst human rights records in the world, but it being the center of radical Islamic fundamentalism, funding terror, that's not, at home, it's just as bad. But the problem was that, and Egypt was nothing pretty either, it was a dictatorship, torture, and so on. But the problem was that the secular nationalist movement, Nasser and others like him, were beginning to call for use of for taking over the resources, energy resources of the Arab world, Arab and Muslim worlds, and using them for the benefit of the people of the region. And that's unacceptable. Those resources are for our use. In fact, in internal documents, they're sometimes even called our resources, and they have to be protected, in particular from the people of the region who don't have any right to them. So secular nationalism was a major enemy. Israel performed a great service to the United States then by essentially destroying the center of secular Arab nationalism and defending radical Islamic fundamentalism. That was a great gift, and it's at that point that the U.S.-Israeli relation was solidified in its current form, the form that remains until now. Major service. That's not unusual. It continues. I'll run through just a few of the highlights. In 1971, 4 years later, the new president of Egypt, President Sadat, offered Israel a full peace treaty. Everything, full normalization relations, everything, in return for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. Actually, he didn't really care much about anything but the Egyptian Sinai. So it was basically an offer of full peace in return for withdrawal from Egyptian territory. Israel considered the offer, decided to reject it. They were, at that time, in the midst of substantial development projects in the Egyptian Sinai. Thousands of peasants were being driven into the desert, towns destroyed, mosques, cemeteries, everything, to prepare the ground for Jewish settlements, a number of Jewish settlements, and also for a major city. They were planning to build the city of Yamit on the coast, a city for all-Jewish city of 1 million people was planned. So they made a choice at that time to prefer expansion to security.